Alright, settle in, make sure you're comfy. We're about to tiptoe back in time, way back to ancient Egypt. Our story begins not with pyramids and pharaohs in general, okay, but with a very particular pharaoh, a queen really, by the name of Cleopatra. And we're not talking about just any queen. Oh no, we're talking about the Cleopatra they kept to themselves. It's married within the family, and generally acted more Greek than Egyptian. Cleopatra was unique in that she actually bothered to learn the Egyptian language and culture. History isn't always clear-cut, you know? It's more like a blurry photograph from a disposable camera you found in your attic. Anyway, when Ptolemy XII finally kicked the bucket in 51 BC, he left the kingdom to Cleopatra, who was around 18 years old at the time, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was probably around 10 or 11. He also left behind a will that stipulated they should rule jointly. Sounds lovely, right? A brother and sister ruling in perfect harmony. This alone made her stand out from her relatives, who were more interested in Greek philosophy and sipping wine than, say, understanding the intricacies of hieroglyphics. The one who launched 1,000 ships, the one who charmed emperors, the one whose story is so tangled with legend that it's hard to separate the history from the, well, let's call it creative storytelling. Power struggles are almost always messy, especially when you throw family dynamics into the mix. Ptolemy XIII, despite being just a kid, had some very ambitious advisors whispering in his ear. These advisors, predictably, weren't too keen on the idea of Cleopatra having any real power. They saw her as a threat, okay? A strong woman who might actually try to run the country for the benefit of the asterisk, okay? Country asterisk, rather than for their own personal gain. Gasp, the audacity. Now, the thing about Cleopatra is, she wasn't exactly born into a stable situation. Think of it less as a serene coronation and more like a slightly chaotic game of throne musical chairs. Her family, the Ptolemies, were descendants of Ptolemy, the first Sotar, one of Alexander the Great's generals. But I digress. Her father was Ptolemy XII Auletes, a king known more for his love of partying and playing the flute than for his political acumen. Scheme. He was, shall we say, extremely unpopular. The Egyptian people weren't thrilled with his constant need to bribe Roman officials to keep his throne. You see, Egypt was becoming increasingly reliant on Rome, and Ptolemy XII was basically paying them off to stay in power. It was like Egypt was slowly becoming a particularly glamorous ATM for the Roman Republic. After Alexander shuffled off this mortal coil, his vast empire was carved up amongst his generals, and Ptolemy grabbed himself Egypt. Smart move, Ptolemy, smart move. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, but they weren't exactly blending in with the locals, if you catch my drift. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. Yes, 69. I always giggle a little when I write that. Now, Cleopatra was one of 6 children, but the exact parentage of some of them is a bit murky. Yeah, no. This is where the challenges part of her story really kicks in. So, these advisors convinced Ptolemy XIII to, shall we say, disagree with his sister on pretty much everything. They started undermining her authority, spreading rumors about her, and generally making her life difficult. Well, Rome at this point was embroiled in its own internal struggles. Think less a grand royal exit and more a hurried escape, possibly involving a donkey and a disguise. She went to Syria and started gathering her own army. But remember, the Romans are still lurking in the background. And as fate would have it, Julius Caesar himself was about to arrive in Egypt. Because when you're trying to reclaim your throne, nothing is more helpful than a Roman general showing up with a bunch of soldiers, right? It's a lot to deal with before you even have your morning coffee, isn't it? But this is just the beginning of Cleopatra's incredible journey. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the drama is about to unfold. Sleep tight, and we'll continue this story tomorrow. Because when your little brother and his cronies are trying to steal your throne, what else are you going to do? Start a book club? I think not. Julius Caesar and Pompey were locked in a power struggle, that would eventually lead to civil war. They managed to secure the support of a good portion of the Egyptian population, or at least enough of the population to make things difficult for Cleopatra. It was a tense situation, a kingdom divided, and a young queen trying to claw her way back to power. This meant that Egypt was caught right in the middle of a very dangerous game. It was like being a small boat in the middle of a hurricane, hoping you don't get crushed by the waves. He was there to chase Pompey, who had fled to Egypt after being defeated in battle. But, as we all know, history is full of unexpected twists and turns, and Cleopatra, being the smart and resourceful woman that she was, knew that Caesar's arrival presented an opportunity, a chance to get back on the throne, and maybe, just maybe, even secure Egypt's future. It was like a particularly nasty episode of sibling rivalry, but with kingdoms at stake. And remember that whole thing about Egypt being reliant on Rome? Eventually, things escalated to the point where Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt. She wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. While Cleopatra was off building her rebel force, Ptolemy XIII and his advisors were busy solidifying their control over Egypt. Now, Kala might be thinking, okay, so she's an exiled queen with an army. That sounds tough, but not that tough. Of course, Caesar's arrival wasn't exactly about helping Cleopatra. So, there you have it, okay? A young queen facing exile, sibling rivalry, power-hungry advisors, and the looming threat of Rome. Ah, family. Isn't it just something? And when you add a royal title, a shimmering throne, and a hefty dose of ambition into the mix, well, you've got yourself a recipe for some seriously intriguing, shall we say, drama. See, after Alexander the Great, the brilliant but rather exhausting conqueror popped his clogs, his vast empire was carved up like a particularly large and complicated birthday cake. They were Greek rulers, sitting on the throne of Egypt, surrounded by Egyptian culture, and trying their best to juggle the two. But behind all the gilded splendor and impressive architecture, the family dynamics were, yes, you heard that right, brother marrying sister, uncle marrying niece. It was all very eternal, and the Ptolemies, bless their hearts, were certainly prone to both physical ailments and questionable choices. See, being a Ptolemaic ruler wasn't just about wearing a fancy crown and waving to the crowds. It was about absolute power. You could command armies, decree laws, okay, and decide who lived and who ... didn't. And that kind of power tends to bring out the worst in people, especially when they're related, okay? There were reports of rulers who were, shall we say, a bit off, and others who were downright tyrannical. Brothers fought brothers, sisters fought sisters, and everyone seemed to be vying for a bigger slice of the Egyptian pie. It's hard to say exactly how much the inbreeding contributed, but it certainly didn't help. Imagine the family reunions. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. Now, this wasn't as uncommon as you might think for royal families back then. The idea was to keep the royal bloodline pure and to prevent squabbles over succession, because nothing says peaceful transfer of power like marrying your brother, right? Well, let us just say there were less harmonious family orchestra and more a Tove-tuned kazoo band battling for the last slice of pizza. It's like trying to knit a sweater while riding a unicycle. Complicated and probably a bit wobbly. And one of his generals, a chap named Ptolemy Isoter, snagged himself Egypt. Good choice, Ptolemy. Good choice. Egypt was rich, fertile, and had a long, storied history. Perfect for a budding dynasty to sink its roots into. And the Ptolemaic dynasty, the family that Cleopatra was born into, well, okay, they weren't exactly known for their peaceful family dinners and harmonious sing-alongs. More like strategically planned banquets with a side of potential poison. Now, to understand the Ptolemies, we have to rewind a bit. But Ptolemy wasn't Egyptian, mind you. He was Greek, and that's a really important thing to remember about the Ptolemies. So, for generations, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, building magnificent temples, fostering trade, and generally making sure that the Nile kept flowing and the taxes kept rolling in. One of the biggest problems stemmed from a delightful little habit the Ptolemies had: marrying their siblings. Of course, inbreeding, as you might imagine, isn't exactly a recipe for robust health and sound decision-making. And then there was the little matter of power. So, plots were hatched, alliances were forged and broken, and daggers were definitely sharpened, metaphorically and probably literally, too. Cleopatra's own family was no exception. Her father, Ptolemy the 12th Elites, a name that sounds like a sneeze disguised as royalty, was exactly a pillar of strength and stability. There was Cleopatra, of course, but she had several siblings, including a brother, Ptolemy the 13th, who was to become her co-ruler. He was known for his love of partying, his extravagant spending, and his general lack of, well, anything resembling good governance. He left a will stipulating that Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 13th should rule jointly. Sounds fair enough, right? A brother and sister working together for the good of Egypt. A heartwarming tale of familial cooperation. Remember that even behind the shimmering facade of royalty, there were real people with real ambitions, real fears, and real family problems. And that sometimes the greatest dramas play out not on the battlefield, but within the walls of a palace. Sweet dreams, okay? He was so reliant on bribes to maintain his power that the Egyptians jokingly referred to him as the flute player. Ptolemy the 13th, egged on by his advisors, wasn't too keen on sharing power with his sister. She was just going to sit around twiddling her thumbs and waiting for her brother to have a change of heart. Because just when Cleopatra was gearing up for a good old-fashioned sibling showdown, a certain Roman general by the name of Julius Caesar decided to pay Egypt a visit. And as we all know, when Caesar arrives, things are never quite the same again. She was a Ptolemy, and Ptolemies, for all their faults, were nothing if not resourceful. She began to gather an army, planning to reclaim her throne by force. He was, after all, a young, ambitious man, and he wasn't about to let a woman tell him what to do. So, he promptly kicked Cleopatra out of Egypt. Rude, right? Especially considering they were supposed to be ruling together, because he was always playing to the Roman tune for money. And Elites had a rather large brood of children, all vying for his attention, and, eventually, the throne. The tensions within the family reached a boiling point when Elites died, except of course, that's not how it played out. Cleopatra, however, wasn't one to take exile lying down, and that, my friends, is where the story really starts to get interesting. So, as you drift off to sleep, think about the Ptolemies, that gloriously dysfunctional family with their sibling marriages, their power struggles, okay, and their penchant for intrigue. Alright, settle in, because now we're getting to the good stuff. Think of it as the political equivalent of finding the comfiest spot on the couch, only with slightly more backstabbing and significantly better eyeliner. We're talking about Cleopatra's, shall we say, strategic relationship with one of history's most famous figures, Julius Caesar. Her father, Ptolemy the 12th Elites, had a knack for making enemies and racking up debts. He managed to irritate pretty much everyone, including the Romans, who were increasingly sticking their noses into Egyptian affairs, mostly to ensure the grain kept flowing to feed their ever-hungry empire. Think of Egypt as the bakery that kept Rome's breadbasket full, and here's where her legendary charm and intelligence came into play. Instead of sending envoys or writing strongly worded letters, Cleopatra decided on a more direct approach. She wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, articulate, and knew exactly how to play the political game. She spoke multiple languages, understood diplomacy, and could discuss philosophy with the best of them. Caesar, a man who appreciated intelligence and ambition, was clearly impressed. Legend has it, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a rug. Yes, you heard me right. A rug, and influence came from understanding people, knowing their weaknesses, and appealing to their desires. She recognized that Caesar, despite his immense power, was still a man with ambitions, desires, and a healthy ego. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of a surprise birthday party, only with considerably higher stakes. You don't want the bakery going out of business. Cleopatra, talk about an entrance. It was bold, it was unexpected, and it certainly got his attention. It was also a clear signal. I'm not playing by your rules. I'm here to negotiate on my terms. Now, you might be thinking, oh, it was all about love and romance. And while there certainly may have been some, yes, you heard that right, brother and husband, incest was, well, it was a Ptolemaic tradition. Think of it as keeping the family business strictly within the family. Anyway, sibling rivalry ensued almost immediately, and Ptolemy XIII, egged on by his advisors, decided he didn't want to share the throne with his older sister. So, Cleopatra was essentially kicked out of Egypt, forced to flee for her life. Not exactly a recipe for a peaceful reign, is it? Chemistry. Let's remember, Cleopatra was first and foremost a queen. And queens, bless their crown-adorned heads, are always playing a game of 4D chess. So, let's unpack this alliance, piece by piece, like a particularly complicated puzzle, shall we? Egypt, at this point was, shall we say, experiencing a bit of a wobble. When Ptolemy XII finally shuffled off this mortal coil, he left the throne to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Enter Julius Caesar. Fresh off the heels of, pretty much conquering everything in sight, Caesar arrived in Egypt, chasing his rival, Pompey. Pompey, unfortunately for him, had already been assassinated by Ptolemy XIII's people, hoping to curry favor with Caesar. Oops. Caesar, being Caesar, wasn't exactly thrilled with this blatant display of interference in Roman affairs. He decided to stick around and sort things out, in that I'm the most powerful man in the world kind of way. Now, Cleopatra knew she needed Caesar on her side. If she ever wanted to get her throne back, imagine being Caesar, sitting in your tent, probably reviewing battle plans or dictating letters, when suddenly someone unrolls a rug and out pops. Whether or not the rug story is entirely true, the fact remains that Cleopatra managed to get face to face with Caesar, and she made an impression. Cleopatra, you see, understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't just about armies and gold, it was about influence. Their alliance was, at its core, a pragmatic one. Caesar needed Egypt's grain to feed his troops and maintain control of Rome. Cleopatra needed Caesar's military might to secure her throne. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, even if it did involve a certain level of personal attachment. After all, they did have a child together, Caesarion, whose name literally means Little Caesar. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra was able to defeat her brother, Ptolemy XIII, who conveniently drowned in the Nile. His enemies used it as ammunition against him, portraying him as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, a man who had lost sight of Roman values. When he was assassinated in 44 BC, Cleopatra's world was once again thrown into turmoil. It shaped her reign, influenced Roman politics, and created a legend that continues to fascinate us to this day. It also demonstrated that in the ancient world, as in modern times, alliances could be forged in the most unexpected of ways, even through a well-timed rug delivery. And with that thought, it's time to close your eyes and drift off to dreamland, where maybe you too will find yourself rolled up in a rug, ready to make a grand entrance. Sweet dreams. So, Cleopatra regained her throne, this time ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV. Well, she secured her throne, ensured the stability of her kingdom, and had a son who, for a brief time, was considered a potential heir to Caesar's empire. She also cemented her place in history as a powerful and intelligent ruler, who was unafraid to use all the tools at her disposal to achieve her goals. Caesar was captivated by Cleopatra's intellect, her wit, and her exotic allure. He spent a considerable amount of time in Egypt, neglecting his duties back in Rome, much to the consternation of the Senate. He even commissioned a new gilded statue of Cleopatra to be placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix in Rome. This was like putting a giant billboard up in Times Square declaring your affection. But their relationship wasn't just about political convenience. Caesar's extended stay in Egypt and his open adoration of Cleopatra caused quite a stir back in Rome. There were whispers of him wanting to move the capital to Alexandria and even declare himself king. Something that definitely didn't sit well with the Roman Republic. After all, they had just gotten rid of kings centuries ago and weren't keen on bringing them back. Ultimately, Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra contributed to his downfall. So what did Cleopatra gain from her alliance with Caesar? Her relationship with Caesar was complex, strategic, and undeniably impactful. Alright, settle in, because now we're getting to the really juicy bit, the Battle of Alexandria. It sounds terribly grand, doesn't it? Like something out of a Cecil B. DeMille epic. Cleopatra, freshly back on the throne, is trying to maintain her grip. He had a little problem back in Rome, a pesky civil war brewing between him and Pompey. And Pompey, in a rather unfortunate turn of events for Pompey, decided to seek refuge in Egypt. The Egyptians, unsurprisingly, were a bit miffed that a Roman army was camping out in their capital. Think of it as a really unpleasant house party where everyone brought weapons and nobody knows how to politely ask the DJ to change the music. Tension simmered, then boiled over. And that, my friends, is where the Battle of Alexandria truly begins. But even geniuses need a bit of luck. The Egyptians, while passionate, weren't exactly known for their military prowess at this point. They were more accustomed to building pyramids and worshipping cats than engaging in complex warfare. Also, the Roman army, being the Roman army, was a force to be reckoned with. Discipline, training, and a whole lot of pointy sticks can go a long way. Cleopatra and Caesar, along with their loyal troops, found themselves holed up in the palace, surrounded by angry Egyptians. Imagine the pressure, stuck inside with limited supplies, while outside, a mob is chanting your name. And not in a complimentary way. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, wasn't exactly thrilled. Having two powerful Roman generals vying for control of her kingdom was like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. A rock and a very well-armed hard place. But she's not exactly universally loved, you see. There are still plenty of folks who prefer to see her gone, preferably in a way that involves very sharp objects and minimal fuss. And while it was a pretty significant turning point for Cleopatra, let's just say the reality was probably a bit less glamorous. Think more strategic chaos, less perfectly choreographed sword fights. So, picture this. Alexandria, the crown jewel of Egypt. A bustling metropolis brimming with scholars, traders, and, of course, political intrigue thicker than the Nile mud. Now, Caesar, bless his ambitious heart, didn't just waltz into Egypt for the scenery. Sadly for Pompey, his gamble didn't pay off. He was assassinated before Caesar even arrived. Awkward. Caesar, upon arriving and finding Pompey already taken care of, was, well, let's just say he wasn't particularly heartbroken, though publicly he expressed outrage. You know, for appearances. He then decided to stick around for a bit, ostensibly to sort things out. But probably also because Egypt was rather pleasant and Cleopatra was, well, Cleopatra. But Caesar's presence didn't exactly bring peace and harmony. The conflict wasn't one big, organized battle. Instead, it was more like a series of skirmishes, sieges, and general mayhem spread out across the city. One of the key events was the siege of the royal palace. Now, Caesar was a military genius, no doubt about it. The fighting was fierce, though. We're talking street-to-street combat, naval battles in the harbor, and probably a few accidental fires started by overzealous soldiers. It was a messy, chaotic affair. Now, this is a bit of a touchy subject, historically. The Library of Alexandria was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, housing countless scrolls and texts. Caesar's forces managed to break the siege and crush the Egyptian resistance. Cleopatra, with Caesar's support, was firmly back in power. She was now more powerful than ever, but also more entangled with the Roman Republic and its internal power struggles. And that, my friends, is a recipe for drama. But for now, let's just think about the fact that she survived a rather unpleasant battle and emerged victorious. Not a bad day's work for a queen, really. And hopefully, a calming close to this section. Sleep well, but the victory came at a cost. Alexandria was scarred by the fighting. The Egyptian economy was in shambles. Cleopatra's dependence on Rome was greater than ever. The exact circumstances of its destruction are still debated by historians. Some say it was completely destroyed during the Battle of Alexandria. She knew that the key to maintaining her power was to keep Rome on her side, okay? And she was very, very good at keeping Rome on her side, okay? Others argue that it was only partially damaged, or that the destruction happened later. Whatever the truth, the fact remains that a significant amount of knowledge was lost during this period, and that's always a tragedy. And amidst all the carnage, Cleopatra was right there in the thick of it, or at least as close to the thick of it as a queen could reasonably be. She wasn't exactly leading charges on horseback, but she was actively involved in the strategy and logistics of the defense. One particularly dramatic moment involved the burning of the Alexandrian library. Imagine it. Scrolls upon scrolls containing the wisdom of generations going up in flames. It's enough to make any bookworm weep. Though, to be fair, Cleopatra probably had more pressing concerns at the time, like not getting overthrown and murdered. Still, one hopes she took a moment to mourn the loss of all that knowledge. Ultimately, the Battle of Alexandria ended with a Roman victory. Now, some might see this as a sign of weakness, but Cleopatra, ever the shrewd politician, used this dependence to her advantage. So, the Battle of Alexandria solidified Cleopatra's power, but it also set the stage for the next chapter in her story. The royal palace. Picture it, if you will. Not just any palace, mind you, but the royal palace of Alexandria, glittering under the Egyptian sun. Now, when we think of palaces, we often conjure up images of endless banquets, lavish parties, and, well, just generally swanning about in silk robes. Cleopatra, being who she was, had access to literally everything. A personal bathing chamber, complete with heated water, fragrant oils, and a team of dedicated bath slaves. After a light breakfast, she would meet with her advisors, generals, scribes, and high-ranking officials to discuss matters of state. This was a crucial part of maintaining Egypt's diplomatic relationships and securing alliances. Picture her, seated on her throne, radiating regal authority as she listened to the entreaties and pronouncements of various envoys. She had to be fluent in several languages, charming yet firm, and always aware of the political undercurrents at play. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring both intelligence and charisma. These meetings could be lengthy and intense, involving debates about everything from crop yields to military strategy. And Cleopatra, being the intelligent and assertive woman she was, wouldn't just sit there and nod politely. She actively participated in these discussions, offering her own insights and making her own decisions. One can almost hear the echoes of her sharp wit and clever arguments bouncing off the palace walls. A private theater for enjoying plays and musical performances. And of course, a state-of-the-art library filled with the wisdom of the ancient world. It's enough to make you want to trade in your Netflix subscription for a papyrus scroll. And while there was certainly an element of that in Cleopatra's daily life, it wasn't all in chariot rides. You see, life in the royal palace wasn't just about lounging around on divans eating figs. Cleopatra was, first and foremost, a ruler. And ruling Egypt in the 1st century BC was no picnic. Her days were filled with audiences, meetings, and weighty decisions that could determine the fate of her kingdom. Imagine having to deal with grumpy merchants, complaining about tariffs, scheming politicians vying for power, and the constant threat of invasion from, well, pretty much everyone. It's a wonder she had time to apply her kohl eyeliner. In fact, being Cleopatra was a surprisingly pressured gig. Let's start with the opulence. The palace itself was a sprawling complex, a veritable city within a city. Think shimmering marble floors cool beneath bare feet, towering columns adorned with intricate carvings depicting gods and pharaohs of old, and gardens bursting with exotic flora, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and lotus. Imagine the sheer scale of the place. You could get lost wandering through its endless corridors, stumbling upon hidden courtyards, private libraries overflowing with scrolls, and rooms dedicated solely to the storage of perfume. Because, let's be honest, one can never have too much perfume, especially when you're trying to impress Roman emperors. And then there were the amenities, shall we say. But all that luxury came at a price. A typical day for Cleopatra likely began before dawn. After these morning meetings, Cleopatra would often hold court, receiving dignitaries and ambassadors from foreign lands. Lunch, one assumes, was a slightly more relaxed affair, perhaps enjoyed in one of the palace's many gardens. But even during mealtimes, Cleopatra was rarely truly off duty. Cleopatra was keenly aware of the importance of infrastructure and economic development, and she took a personal interest in ensuring that Egypt remained a prosperous and thriving kingdom. Cleopatra was a woman of considerable charm and allure, and she had a reputation for enjoying the company of men. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony are, of course, the stuff of legend. But even aside from these high-profile romances, Cleopatra undoubtedly had a circle of friends and confidants with whom she could relax and unwind. She was a shrewd politician, a skilled diplomat, and a strong and independent woman who defied the expectations of her time. And while she certainly enjoyed the perks of royal life, she also bore the weight of responsibility for her kingdom and her people. It's a heavy crown to wear, even when it's made of gold. Imagine the whispered conversations, the shared jokes, the moments of genuine connection amidst the pomp and circumstance of courtly life. After all, a happy populace is a less rebellious populace. She might use the opportunity to consult with trusted friends or advisors, or to simply observe the goings-on around her, gathering information and assessing the mood of the court. A queen never truly rests. You see, she's always on, always observing, always strategizing. The afternoons were often devoted to more administrative tasks, such as signing decrees, reviewing financial reports, and overseeing the construction of public works projects, and trying to maintain her power and influence in a world dominated by men. It's no wonder she relied on her intelligence, her charm, and her sheer force of will to survive. And then, of course, there was the matter of her personal life. Its evenings might be spent attending a banquet or a theatrical performance, or perhaps simply enjoying a quiet evening with her children. But even during these moments of leisure, Cleopatra was always aware of her responsibilities. She was always on display, always representing Egypt to the world. The pressures of being Cleopatra were immense. She was constantly juggling competing demands, navigating treacherous political waters. So, the next time you picture Cleopatra in your mind's eye, remember that she was more than just a beautiful face and a luxurious lifestyle. Now, picture this: Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, not just sitting on a throne, mind you, but perched rather cleverly on the fulcrum between two massive cultures: the ancient and deeply rooted traditions of Egypt and the dazzling, intellectually vibrant world of Hellenistic Greece. It's a balancing act that would make even the most seasoned tightrope walker sweat. But Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist and, let's be honest, a bit of a showwoman, managed it with a flair that still echoes through history. Egypt, at this point, had been absorbing Greek influence for centuries, ever since Alexander the Great, that whirlwind of a conqueror, swept through and left a Greek-speaking dynasty, the Ptolemies, in charge. Instead, she promoted syncretism, the merging of different beliefs. Serapis was a god combining aspects of Osiris, the Egyptian god of the afterlife, and Apis, the sacred bull, with elements of Greek deities like Zeus and Hades. She spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, a rarity for the Ptolemies, who tended to stick to Greek. Speaking Egyptian allowed her to connect directly with the Egyptian people, bypassing the need for translators and demonstrating a respect for their culture. It was a bit like a politician today, learning a few phrases in a foreign language to impress voters. Only in Cleopatra's case was actually genuine and effective. The Serapeum, the grand temple dedicated to Serapis in Alexandria, became a major center of worship and a symbol of Cleopatra's efforts to bridge the cultural divide. It was a brilliant PR move, really. A bit like launching a new social media platform that everyone thinks is cool, even if they secretly prefer the old one. She identified Egyptian gods with their Greek counterparts, creating a sort of divine hybrid. For example, Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic and motherhood, became closely associated with Demeter, the Greek goddess of agriculture and fertility. This made it easier for people from both cultures to understand and accept each other's beliefs, fostering a sense of shared spirituality. But Cleopatra wasn't just another Ptolemy, passively accepting the Greekification of her kingdom. She was actively, deliberately, and quite strategically blending the two cultures to create something unique, something that would solidify her power and, crucially, make her people feel well united, or at least less likely to revolt. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to make a smoothie. You've got your mangoes, representing the rich, sun-drenched traditions of Egypt, and your Greek yogurt, cool and sophisticated. You could just eat them separately, but where's the fun in that? Cleopatra decided to throw them in a blender, add a splash of honey, and create a delicious, power-boosting concoction. One of the most visible ways she did this was through religion. Now, Egyptian religion was complex, to say the least. Gods with animal heads, elaborate rituals, and a whole pantheon of deities whose relationships were more tangled than a ball of yarn after a kitten attack. The Greeks, on the other hand, had their own pantheon, equally complex, but with a slightly different flavor. More emphasis on human-like gods with very human flaws. Cleopatra's genius was in finding the common ground. She didn't try to force Egyptians to worship Zeus or Greeks to pray to Anubis. And let's not forget the Serapis cult. This was a deliberately constructed religion designed to appeal to both Egyptians and Greeks. But Cleopatra's cultural fusion wasn't just about religion. It permeated every aspect of her rule. She also adopted Egyptian customs and traditions, appearing in public dressed as Isis, complete with the elaborate headdress and royal regalia. This wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a deliberate attempt to identify herself with the ancient traditions of Egypt, and to present herself as the rightful heir to the pharaohs. The Library of Alexandria, already a legendary institution, continued to flourish under her rule, attracting scholars and artists from all over the Greek world. Cleopatra herself was a patron of the arts and sciences, and she encouraged the development of new ideas and technologies. She cultivated an image that was both Egyptian and Greek, both exotic and sophisticated. It wasn't always successful, and there were certainly tensions between the different cultural groups within her kingdom. But as a cultural blender, skillfully combining the mangoes and Greek yogurt of her kingdom into a delicious and ultimately quite unforgettable smoothie. And remember, sometimes the best things in life are a little bit of both, but her efforts to bridge the cultural divide and to create a sense of shared identity were a key factor in her ability to rule Egypt for over 2 decades and to leave a lasting legacy on the ancient world. She was portrayed in art and literature as a powerful and alluring ruler, a woman who embodied the best of both worlds. This image helped to cement her power and to project an aura of authority and mystique. It was a carefully crafted brand, and it worked wonders. It was a bit like being the CEO of a tech company that also happens to own a major art museum. It's a very stylish CEO, that is. Imagine the impact. It was the equivalent of a modern-day monarch suddenly deciding to wear medieval armor to Parliament. It would definitely grab attention. Egyptian art and architecture began to incorporate Greek elements, and Greek art and literature began to reflect Egyptian themes. It was a cultural exchange on a grand scale, a sort of ancient version of the Erasmus program, but with more power struggles and fewer questionable student loan debts. At the same time, she embraced Greek culture and learning, turning Alexandria into a center of intellectual and artistic activity. Her court was a melting pot of Egyptian and Greek influences, with both Egyptian and Greek courtiers, artists, and intellectuals mingling and exchanging ideas. And, of course, we can't forget the impact of this cultural fusion on Cleopatra's image. Ultimately, Cleopatra's blending of Egyptian and Greek traditions was a complex and multifaceted strategy aimed at uniting her kingdoms, consolidating her power, and projecting an image of strength and sophistication. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of Cleopatra not just as a queen. Caesarion, now, that's a name that just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? It sounds like a delicious Italian dessert, or perhaps a very small, slightly pompous Roman emperor. But in reality, it was the nickname, the sort of pet name, given to Ptolemy, the 15th Philopator Caesar, son of Cleopatra, and, you guessed it, Julius Caesar. A mouthful, I know. Well, stick with Caesarion, which charmingly translates to Little Caesar. Cleopatra likely envisioned a future where her son would rule over a vast territory, combining the best aspects of both worlds. It was a bold, ambitious vision, and one that probably kept her up at night, scheming and dreaming. Imagine the stir that little bundle of joy caused when he arrived in 47 BC. Cleopatra, ever the savvy queen, was making quite the impression on Rome, and indeed, the man who ran the place. Having a child with Caesar was, well, it was a power move of epic proportions. First, it tied Cleopatra in Egypt even closer to Rome, creating a personal and political bond with the most powerful man in the world. For Cleopatra, this was invaluable. While wealthy and culturally rich, needed Rome's protection and influence to maintain its independence. Having Caesar as the father of her son gave her leverage, a bargaining chip of the highest order. It was almost like saying, you mess with Egypt, you mess with Caesar's flesh and blood. It wasn't just about love and cuddles, it was about solidifying her dynasty's position on the world stage. Now, Caesar, being Caesar, never officially acknowledged Caesarion as his heir. Roman law was rather picky about these things, and Caesar already had an adopted son, Octavian, waiting in the wings. Can you imagine the family dinners? It's awkward, to say the least. But the fact that Caesar did unacknowledge him publicly is not to say he denied the child. He was immensely proud of him and made sure the world knew he was indeed the son of the great Julius Caesar. He allowed Cleopatra and Caesarion to reside in a villa in Rome, even erecting a golden statue of Cleopatra as Venus Genatrix. It all added to Cleopatra's allure and exotic nature, much of which was deliberately cultivated. The birth of Caesarion was significant for several reasons. Secondly, Caesarion represented the potential for a new kind of empire, one that blended Roman might with Egyptian wealth and culture. Thirdly, and perhaps most subtly, Caesarion's existence challenged the established Roman order. Here was a child who was both Roman and Egyptian, a living symbol of the blurring lines between cultures and empires. This was unsettling to some Romans, who valued tradition and saw Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign influence. After all, they already believed Julius Caesar to be a tyrant, and Cleopatra was accused of bewitching him. It was the stuff of scandal sheets, no doubt. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the political landscape in Rome shifted dramatically. Antony, after hearing false rumors of Cleopatra's death, committed suicide. Cleopatra, faced with the prospect of being paraded through Rome as a prisoner, chose a more dignified exit. Legend has it that she allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, a venomous snake. he was just 17 years old, barely on the cusp of adulthood. With his death, the line of Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt came to an end, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. It was a sad and rather anticlimactic end for a boy who had been born into such privilege and promise. It's a stark reminder that even royal blood and being the son of the most powerful man in the world cannot guarantee a happy ending. Though it's generally agreed she was likely murdered for the good of Octavian's PR, Cleopatra, sensing the danger, returned to Egypt with Caesarion, leaving behind the chaos and intrigue of Roman politics. Well, Octavian, not one to leave loose ends, saw him as a potential future rival. He couldn't allow Caesarion to grow up and rally support against him. The little boy represented a constant threat to Octavian's newfound power. There are some accounts that Caesarion fled to India, though this seems unlikely. The power vacuum in Rome led to a series of civil wars, with Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, emerging as the victor. Octavian, a shrewd and ruthless politician, saw Caesarion as a threat to his own claim to Caesar's legacy. He represents the collision of two great civilizations, the fleeting nature of power and the often cruel realities of politics. He never truly got a chance to rule, to prove himself, or to fulfill the potential that his mother so fiercely believed he possessed. Instead, he became a footnote in history, a reminder of what might have been. In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, Octavian's fleet decisively defeated Antony and Cleopatra's. It's more like a poignant reminder that even with all the power, glamour, and riches in the world, life can still be fragile and unpredictable. And that, my friend, is something to ponder as you drift off to sleep. Good night. It was a turning point in history, marking the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. And it spelled doom for Cleopatra and her family. After all, a real son of Caesar had a stronger, more legitimate claim to the throne than an adopted one, no matter what the Roman law said. It created a rivalry that would eventually lead to tragedy. Back in Alexandria, she declared Caesarion co-ruler, officially known as Ptolemy the 15th Caesar. Their relationship was, to put it mildly, complicated. It was a mix of love, lust, political expediency, and perhaps a touch of mutual desperation. Together, they presented a formidable challenge to Octavian's growing power, and together, they had children of their own. Twins, in fact. Talk about adding fuel to the fire. Was a clear statement. Caesarion was not just a cute baby. He was a king, a pharaoh, a legitimate heir to the Ptolemaic dynasty, and, in Cleopatra's eyes, a potential successor to Caesar himself. However, things didn't quite go according to plan. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, allied herself with Mark Antony, another powerful Roman general. But alas, their combined forces were no match for Octavian's. Following their defeat, Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, where they both eventually met their end. So, what became of Caesarion, the little Caesar? Therefore, Octavian ordered Caesarion's execution. Caesarion's story is a poignant one. He was a pawn in a Game of Thrones, a symbol of ambition, power, and ultimately, tragedy. It is a rather sad ending, I suppose. But even in sadness, there is a certain beauty. Perhaps beauty is not the right word. Ah, Mark Antony. Now there's a name that conjures up images of, well, probably slightly sweaty Roman generals and maybe some grapes. But behind the military prowess and the political maneuvering, there was a man who, shall we say, had a weakness for a certain Egyptian queen. Cleopatra, having successfully navigated the tricky waters of Roman politics with Julius Caesar, is now facing a new Roman player on the stage, Mark Antony. He's one of the triumvirs, ruling the Roman world after Caesar's assassination, and he's summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in modern-day Turkey, ostensibly to answer some questions about her loyalty and support. Queen who knew exactly how to play the game of love, power, and strategic alliance. He was also, let's be blunt, impressed by her wealth and the resources she controlled. Egypt was a vital source of grain for Rome, and Cleopatra held the key to that supply. She arrived on a barge, a truly magnificent vessel, decked out in gold. She herself was dressed as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. Can you imagine the sheer spectacle? The air thick with perfume, the music playing, the Queen of Egypt reclining on cushions of purple and gold. Mark Antony, a seasoned Roman general, probably thought he was dreaming. So, how did this unlikely romance blossom? Picture this. It's 41 BC. He was also, let's be honest, known for his enthusiasms. She entertained Antony with lavish banquets, exotic performances, and stimulating conversation. She showed him the wonders of Egypt, its ancient history, its vibrant culture, its immense wealth, and she made him feel, well, important. Something that, even for a triumvirate, was apparently quite appealing. He enjoyed a good party, a good drink, in the company of, shall we say, interesting people. Cleopatra provided all of that in spades. She wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, witty, and spoke several languages. She could discuss philosophy one minute and negotiate trade agreements the next. In short, she was exactly the kind of person Antony needed, or at least thought he needed, by his side. Now, Cleopatra wasn't just going to show up in her everyday linen dress and sandals. Oh no, she knew how to make an entrance. Cleopatra, being no fool, understood that Antony was a man driven by ambition, power, and perhaps a touch of loneliness. Their initial meetings weren't just about political posturing. Oh, there was plenty of that, of course, but Cleopatra knew how to weave a spell. Antony, for his part, was undeniably smitten. He was captivated by Cleopatra's charm, her intelligence, and her sheer force of personality. Over time, their alliance deepened into a passionate love affair. They spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC together in Alexandria, indulging in a life of luxury and pleasure. This was a complicated entanglement of power, politics, and personal desires. Antony even declared that Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, was Caesar's true heir, a move that directly challenged the ambitions of Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. He portrayed Antony as a puppet of the Egyptian queen, man who had abandoned his Roman duty for the allure of foreign riches and pleasures. He stirred up anti-Egyptian sentiment in Rome, painting Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress who threatened the stability of the Republic. Cleopatra's fleet, for reasons that are still debated by historians, withdrew from the battle. Octavian was hot on their heels, determined to bring them to justice, or rather, to eliminate them as rivals. Antony, seeing his ally retreating, followed suit. The battle was lost, and with it, Antony's chances of defeating Octavian. With no hope of resistance, Antony, facing imminent capture, took his own life. She famously arranged to have a poisonous asp smuggled into her chamber, and with it, she ended her life, bringing an end to the Ptolemaic dynasty and marking the final chapter of ancient Egypt's independent history. She held out for a little longer, hoping to negotiate with Octavian and perhaps even save her kingdom. But she soon realized that her fate was sealed. Octavian intended to parade her through the streets of Rome as a trophy of his victory, a humiliation she was unwilling to endure. The story goes that he received false news of Cleopatra's death and, despairing, fell on his sword. Antony was still married, for one thing, to Fulvia, a Roman noblewoman with political ambitions of her own. It's a tale of passion, ambition, and political intrigue, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are subject to the same human emotions as the rest of us. And perhaps, just perhaps, a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing love and politics. After all, sometimes a little less passion and a little more prudence might be just what the doctor ordered. But then again, where would the fun be in that? Now, close your eyes and imagine those golden barges sailing down the Nile. And the Roman world wasn't exactly thrilled about their leader cavorting with a foreign queen. They saw it as a betrayal of Roman values and a threat to Roman power. They formed a bond that was based not only on mutual attraction, but also on shared ambition. Cleopatra saw in Antony a means to secure her throne and restore Egypt to its former glory. Antony saw in Cleopatra a partner who could provide him with the resources and influence he needed to achieve his own political goals. Now, this wasn't just a simple case of boy meets girl. They fall in love and live happily ever after. But Antony and Cleopatra were too caught up in their own world to care much about what Rome thought. They had children together, further cementing their bond. The repercussions of their romance rippled throughout the Roman world. Octavian, a shrewd and ambitious politician, used Antony's relationship with Cleopatra to his advantage. The tension between Octavian and Antony eventually erupted into open conflict. In 31 BC, the forces of Octavian and Antony clashed at the Battle of Actium. It was a naval battle that would determine the fate of both Egypt and the Roman world. Cleopatra and Antony were both present at the battle, commanding their respective fleets. Unfortunately for them, things didn't go according to plan. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, where they knew their time was limited. In 30 BC, Octavian's forces invaded Egypt. Cleopatra, however, was still alive. And so, in a final act of defiance, Cleopatra chose to die on her own terms. The romance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony, though ultimately tragic, remains one of history's most enduring love stories. Alright, settle in a little deeper, fluff up those pillows, and let's talk about something that was, well, let's just say it was a choice. Cleopatra and Mark Antony, deeply in love, decided to publicly declare their intentions for the future of, well, basically everything they could get their hands on. A bold, audacious, possibly slightly insane choice. We're talking about the donations of Alexandria. That's where it gets interesting. They weren't really donating in the traditional sense. It was more like assigning ownership to their children. Publicly, with a huge ceremony in Alexandria, naturally. Alexander Helios, whose name means Alexander the Sun, was given Armenia, Media. So, to recap, we have kids being given kingdoms they haven't earned, territories that mostly belong to other people, and a very public display of defiance against Rome itself. Parthia, Cleopatra Selene, meaning Cleopatra the Moon, received Cyrenaica and Libya. Basically, chunks of North Africa. And then your neighbor decides to throw a party and announce that they are re-giving away all the parking spaces in the building, including yours, to their pet chihuahua. Antony, a Roman general, had embraced Egyptian customs, adopted the trappings of a pharaoh, and allied himself with a powerful queen. This was seen as a betrayal of Roman values and a rejection of Roman authority. You'd be a little peeved, right? That's kind of how the Romans felt. She was a queen, a diplomat, and a shrewd politician. The ambition, the spectacle, the sheer audacity of it all. It's quite a story, isn't it? And now, perhaps a little easier to drift off to sleep, knowing that even the most powerful people in history sometimes make questionable decisions. Sweet dreams. The donations of Alexandria, while intended to secure the future of Cleopatra's children and strengthen her alliance with Antony, ultimately contributed to their downfall. Just a friendly tip from history. It was a gamble that backfired spectacularly, leading to the Battle of Actium and the tragic end of their reign. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on its ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the Mediterranean. By aligning herself with Antony, she hoped to secure Egypt's future and restore its former glory. Except instead of parking spaces, it was provinces. And instead of a chihuahua, it was Cleopatra's children. Because where else would you announce something so potentially inflammatory? Now, don't let the word donations fool you. Octavian, ever the master of propaganda, seized upon this event as proof that Antony had completely gone native, fallen under Cleopatra's seductive spell, and was plotting to create a new Eastern Empire independent of Rome. And honestly, it wasn't entirely wrong. Antony, despite his He painted her as a foreign temptress, a danger to Roman virtue, and a threat to the Republic. He skillfully manipulated public opinion, turning the Roman people against Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra were signaling that they weren't just lovers, okay? They were partners in power, and they intended to create a dynasty that would rule the East. They were playing the long game, thinking generations ahead, which, in theory, is a good thing, okay? But perhaps not when you're actively antagonizing the most powerful empire in the world. Complicated relationship with Rome, but still a Roman general. There was Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, with Julius Caesar. Antony formally acknowledged him as Caesar's legitimate son and heir. This was a direct challenge to Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and the man who would eventually become the first Roman emperor. You can imagine how well that went down. He was supposed to be upholding Roman interests, not carving up Roman territory and handing it out like party favors. This wasn't like dropping a few drachmas in a charity box. Cleopatra, dressed as Isis, the powerful Egyptian goddess of magic and motherhood, sat on a golden throne beside Antony, radiating power. Their children were presented to the crowd, each one dressed in elaborate finery. This was more like rearranging the entire map of the Eastern Mediterranean and saying, yeah, this looks better. Think of it as the ancient world's most extravagant and arguably most disastrous real estate transaction. Now, you might be thinking, donations. Who were they donating to? To understand the sheer audacity of this, you need to remember the Roman Republic. The ceremony itself was quite the spectacle. A gilded platform was erected in the gymnasium of Alexandria. Now, let's meet the beneficiaries, shall we? Then there were Antony and Cleopatra's twins, Alexander, Helios, and Cleopatra Selene. And lastly, there was Ptolemy Philadelphus, their youngest son. He was awarded Syria and Cilicia. The Romans, understandably, were not amused. The donations of Alexandria were essentially a public declaration of intent. Think of it this way. Imagine you're living in a perfectly nice apartment. The political fallout was immense. The donations of Alexandria gave Octavian the perfect pretext to declare war, not on Rome's rival, but on Cleopatra herself. It's important to remember that this wasn't just about territory. It was about power, ambition, and the clash of cultures. And Cleopatra, well, she was playing her own game. Of course, as we know, things didn't quite work out that way. So, next time you're thinking about rearranging the furniture in your life, maybe think twice before you start handing out entire kingdoms. Now, take a deep breath, let that all sink in. The Battle of Actium. Picture this. It's 31 BC. The Mediterranean shimmers, deceptively calm under the hot sun. But on the horizon, a storm is brewing, not of wind and rain, but of ships and ambition. We're talking about the naval battle of Actium, a truly decisive clash that, for Cleopatra, sadly marked the beginning of her grand and rather dramatic downfall. They were living large in Egypt, co-ruling, issuing decrees that ruffled Roman feathers, and generally acting like they were running the whole show, which, in their defense, they kind of were in the eastern part of the Roman world. Both Antony and Octavian had assembled massive fleets. Antony, with Cleopatra at his side, had the larger ships built for ramming and boarding. They were like floating fortresses, designed to intimidate and overwhelm. Octavian, on the other hand, had smaller, more maneuverable vessels, crewed by experienced sailors. Octavian, however, wasn't too keen on sharing power, especially not with the queen he painted as a seductive, manipulative foreigner. The battle itself wasn't the glorious, decisive victory one might imagine. It was a bit of a muddle, really. The larger ships of Antony and Cleopatra, while impressive, proved difficult to maneuver in the relatively confined waters. Some historians believe it was a prearranged signal, part of a secret plan to escape if things went south. Others think she simply realized the battle was lost and decided to cut her losses, prioritizing her own safety and the preservation of her kingdom. Still others suggest a more colorful explanation involving miscommunication, panicked orders, or even a sudden craving for figs. Octavian's smaller ships zipped around them like pesky gnats, harassing and disrupting their formations. He launched a propaganda campaign that would make modern spin doctors blush, portraying Antony as a lovesick fool under Cleopatra's spell, ready to betray Rome for the sake of her. In the midst of the battle, Cleopatra, for reasons historians still debate, suddenly ordered her fleet of Egyptian warships, a significant portion of Antony's forces, to break through the enemy lines and sail away. Yes, you read that right. She just left exotic charms. Now, you might be thinking, naval battle sounds a bit loud for bedtime. Octavian, being the savvy politician he was, managed to turn public opinion firmly against Antony and Cleopatra. War was declared, not officially on Cleopatra, mind you, but on Antony, conveniently framing her as the root of all evil. It's always convenient to have someone to blame, isn't it? And you'd be right. Battles are rarely quiet affairs. But let's focus on the human element, the strategy, and the sheer oddity of it all, shall we? We'll keep the cannon fire to a gentle poof sound effect in your imagination, okay? So, who's involved in this nautical kerfuffle? On one side, we have Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and her devoted Roman ally, Mark Antony. On the other, we have Octavian, Antony's rival, another Roman bigwig with a serious case of ambition and a rather large fleet. Think of it as a family feud, but with warships and a kingdom at stake. Antony and Cleopatra, you see, have been causing quite a stir in Rome, and, well, let's just say the Romans ate it up. So, with war declared, the two sides met at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. Now, here's where things get a little, well, unexpected. And then, something rather peculiar happened. Now, why would she do such a thing? Whatever the reason, Cleopatra's departure had a devastating effect on Antony's forces. Seeing their queen abandon the fight, morale plummeted. Many of Antony's ships followed Cleopatra, while others were left to fend for themselves against Octavian's relentless attacks. He lost a significant portion of his fleet, and more importantly, he lost the will to fight. The battle shattered his reputation and left him vulnerable to Octavian's advancing armies. Octavian pursued them relentlessly, his forces closing in on Alexandria. Antony, defeated and despondent, launched a few desperate attempts to rally his remaining troops, but it was all in vain. The writing was on the wall, or rather, etched into the sands of Egypt. It was, in essence, the beginning of the end for Antony and Cleopatra's joint reign. Remember the clash of ships, the ambition of empires, and the tragic love story of Antony and Cleopatra. And remember that even the most powerful figures can be brought down by a combination of bad luck, bad decisions, and a sudden, unexplained urge to abandon ship, tweak dreams. Antony, heartbroken, also abandoned the battle, joining Cleopatra in her escape to Egypt. The Battle of Actium wasn't a total annihilation for Antony's forces, but it was a decisive blow. Imagine the scene: Cleopatra sailing away from the chaos, the smoke and the screams fading behind her. He fell on his sword, a dramatic gesture befitting a Roman general, but ultimately a futile one. Cleopatra, being Cleopatra, was not about to let that happen. It was a turning point, a moment of profound consequence that altered the course of history. It marked the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, with Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, as its first emperor. And it marked the end of Cleopatra's reign, the final chapter in the life of one of history's most fascinating and enigmatic figures. She chose her own ending, a story we'll delve into later. Cleopatra, still alive, but realizing the game was up, prepared for her own exit. Antony, torn between duty and love, reluctantly following his dreams of empire crumbling around him. They must have felt a profound sense of dread, knowing that their carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Back in Egypt, the situation deteriorated rapidly, and then, in a final act of tragic drama, Antony, hearing false rumors of Cleopatra's death, took his own life. She knew that Octavian intended to parade her through the streets of Rome as a trophy of war, a symbol of his victory. The Battle of Actium, therefore, wasn't just a naval battle. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the Battle of Actium. As the sun began to set on Cleopatra's reign, casting long, melancholic shadows across the marble halls of Alexandria, the reality of Rome's relentless advance became impossible to ignore. Imagine the scene, the scent of incense mingling with the ever-present, slightly musty aroma of papyrus scrolls, the rhythmic lapping of the Mediterranean against the harbor walls, and, underlying it all, a palpable sense of dread. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, knew that her charm, her wit, and even her considerable wealth were rapidly losing their potency against the unwavering might of Octavian. Now, Cleopatra wasn't just tossing a few gold coins into a fountain and hoping for the best. He politely, but firmly, declined. Apparently, becoming the sole ruler of the Roman world was a bit more appealing than a few extra truckloads of treasure. Go figure. He wanted Egypt. He wanted Cleopatra's throne. She knew that Octavian posed a significant threat to Caesarion's life, fearing that he might become a rallying point for any potential rebellion against Roman rule. Cleopatra desperately wanted to ensure Caesarion's safety and, ideally, secure his position as her successor. Albeit under Roman oversight, K wanted to cement his power and solidify his image as the savior of Rome, as the man who had vanquished a foreign queen and brought Egypt under Roman control. He listened politely to the emissaries, perhaps even offering them a refreshing cup of hibiscus tea, but his resolve remained unshaken. She appealed to the Egyptian people, reminding them of her lineage, her commitment to their well-being, and the prosperity that Egypt had enjoyed under her rule. She organized public ceremonies, distributed food and resources, and attempted to rekindle the flames of Egyptian patriotism. No, this was Cleopatra-level bribery, which meant offering Octavian a considerable chunk of Egypt's treasury. She sent emissaries, seasoned in the art of negotiation and flattery, to reason with Octavian. Cleopatra envisioned a future where Caesarion could rule a portion of Egypt, perhaps as a client king under Roman supervision. She even considered sending him into exile, far beyond the reach of Octavian, to a safe haven where he could grow up in peace and perhaps, one day, reclaim his birthright. They argued that Egypt was a valuable ally, a vital source of grain for Rome, and that her continued rule would be beneficial to both nations. Think mountains of gold, shimmering jewels, and enough grain to feed the entire Roman army for, well, quite a long time. The offer was presented with all the theatrical flair she could muster, ambassadors laden with riches, practically groaning under the weight of their diplomatic pouches. The whispers of Rome's impending arrival were no longer whispers. They were a swelling chorus, carried on the desert winds and the worried faces of her courtiers. Fortunately for Cleopatra, Octavian wasn't quite as susceptible to bribery as some of his predecessors. With bribery failing, Cleopatra turned to diplomacy. The problem, of course, was that Octavian wasn't interested in alliances or peaceful coexistence. As the Roman legions drew nearer, Cleopatra began to focus on securing her legacy, particularly for her son, Caesarion, the alleged son of Julius Caesar. But the sands of time were running out. With Octavian's forces closing in, Cleopatra made one final, desperate attempt to rally support. However, years of war, political instability, and the weight of heavy taxation had taken their toll. The Egyptian people were weary, and many were skeptical of Cleopatra's promises. The Roman legions were disciplined, well-equipped, and led by experienced commanders. Loyalties shifted, rumors spread like wildfire, and trusted advisors began to betray Cleopatra's confidence. The queen, once surrounded by unwavering support, found herself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. She began to question everyone, suspecting plots and conspiracies at every turn. The prospect of facing them in battle was daunting, and the allure of Roman gold and Roman citizenship proved too tempting for some. It was here, surrounded by her most loyal attendants, that she contemplated her next move. She was, after all, Cleopatra. And her story, even in its final act, was far from over. She still had a few tricks up her sleeve, a few more moves to make before the curtain finally fell on her extraordinary life. Surrender was unthinkable, but resistance seemed futile. The game, it seemed, was over. Desertions became increasingly common, further weakening Cleopatra's already fragile defenses. Some saw Octavian as a liberator, a man who would bring stability and an end to the endless power struggles. Others simply wanted to be left alone, to till their fields and live in peace, regardless of who ruled them. This rumor, whether true or not, sparked a wave of panic and unrest. The Alexandrian mob, notoriously fickle and easily swayed, turned against Cleopatra, demanding that she remain and fight for their city. Even Cleopatra's loyal troops, the backbone of her army, began to waver. Meanwhile, within the royal palace, intrigue and paranoia festered. The Roman army was at the gates of Alexandria, and the city was on the brink of collapse. Cleopatra's desperate efforts to save her kingdom had failed. The once proud queen, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was now facing the grim reality of defeat. One particularly unfortunate incident involved a rumor that Cleopatra was planning to flee Alexandria, abandoning her people and her kingdom to the Romans. Cleopatra, desperate to maintain order and quell the uprising, made a public appearance, reaffirming her commitment to Egypt and promising to defend Alexandria to the last. She even went so far as to execute several individuals who were suspected of spreading the rumors, hoping to send a clear message that dissent would not be tolerated. However, these measures proved to be too little, too late, as the Roman siege tightened its grip on Alexandria. Cleopatra retreated to a mausoleum, a magnificent structure she had commissioned for herself, filled with treasures and designed to serve as her final resting place. But even in the face of defeat, Cleopatra remained a force to be reckoned with. Ah, yes, the grand finale, the bit where our Cleopatra, after a life of, shall we say, significant activity, shuffles off this mortal coil. We've reached the mysterious end, the subject of countless paintings, plays, and dramatic reenactments, most of which probably get the details wrong. A slinky, venomous little snake smuggled into Cleopatra's quarters in a basket of figs. Now, let's just pause there for a moment. A basket of figs. It sounds rather idyllic, doesn't it? Cited that she would rather meet her maker on her own terms than be paraded through the streets of Rome as a conquered queen. A perfectly understandable sentiment, really. Imagine the humiliation. It's all those sneering Roman faces. No thank you. A graceful exit was definitely in order. In this case, Cleopatra's loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, did one just pop down to the local reptile emporium and say, "Good morning, I'd like one moderately venomous asp, please." For, personal reasons. And how did they manage to smuggle them past the Roman guards? Did they bribe them with extra figs? These two ladies, apparently, followed their queen into the afterlife, either by also succumbing to asp bites or by other means. He wanted to portray Cleopatra as a defeated enemy, a dangerous temptress who had tried to undermine the might of Rome. He certainly didn't want to acknowledge that she had chosen death over humiliation, thereby robbing him of his victory parade. So, a bit of convenient. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, came to an end. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, and Octavian, now known as Augustus, became the first Roman emperor. Reinterpretation of the facts wouldn't be entirely out of character. Asp, as it turns out, is a rather vague term, okay? It could refer to several different species of venomous snakes found in the region. Perhaps Cleopatra did use an asp, but perhaps she also had a little help along the way. Perhaps the Romans turned a blind eye, or even subtly encouraged her self-destruction. We'll likely never know for sure. Some scholars believe it was an Egyptian cobra, others a viper. Picture her sailing down the Nile, resplendent in gold, her barge laden with treasures, her wit as sharp as any asp's fang. Remember her as the woman who captivated emperors and defied empires, and let her story be a reminder that even in the face of inevitable endings, we can still choose how we meet our fate. Did Octavian, eager to avoid a messy public execution, arrange for Cleopatra to be, shall we say, tragic figure, a powerful queen, a cunning politician, and a woman who chose to die on her own terms? The asp, whether real or symbolic, became her emblem, a symbol of her defiance and her enduring allure. Assisted in her suicide, poisoned wine, a strategically placed dagger. The possibilities are endless, and the evidence is, shall we say again, murky. The specific type of snake is surprisingly important because it affects the plausibility of the story. Cobras, for example, are relatively large snakes, making them harder to conceal in a fig basket. Vipers, on the other hand, are smaller, but their venom is often more painful and less likely to produce the quick, relatively painless death that Cleopatra supposedly experienced. The sources aren't particularly clear. It all sounds rather rushed, doesn't it? Oh dear, the queen's dead. Quick, someone fetch another snake. Imagine you're feeling a bit peckish, perhaps a little world-weary after all that politicking and romance. And the lovely servant presents you with a basket brimming with sweet, juicy figs. Perfect for a bedtime snack. I mean, who really knows? Some historians suspect that Cleopatra may have actually used a different poison altogether, perhaps a concoction of hemlock or opium, carefully prepared to ensure a swift and dignified demise. It wouldn't be beyond her, would it? Our Cleopatra was nothing if not resourceful. The story, as it's usually told, involves an asp, except lurking amongst the fruit, it's a deadly serpent with a temperament about as agreeable as a Roman senator on a Tuesday morning. The legend goes that Cleopatra, facing imminent capture by Octavian, he was still looming, remember? Cleopatra, adorned in her royal robes, perhaps with her crown slightly askew, embraces death with regal dignity. The asp bites, the venom does its work, and Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, breathes her last. So, she arranged for the asp to be brought to her. Now, here's where things get a bit murky. Did she bravely reach into the fig basket, grab the asp, and nonchalantly allow it to bite her on the arm? Or did she, perhaps, encourage it with a golden prod, hoping for a quick and relatively painless death? Historical accounts vary, and frankly, nobody was really there to give us a reliable witness account. We're relying on second, third, even fourth-hand accounts filtered through centuries of Roman propaganda. So, a pinch of salt is definitely required. The traditional narrative, however, paints a picture of noble self-sacrifice. But wait, there's more. Because no good death scene is complete without a supporting cast. The whole thing is just riddled with questions. For instance, where did they get these aspies? Were they readily available in ancient Egypt? And then there's the asp itself. Furthermore, the symptoms described in historical accounts don't quite match the effects of any known snake venom. And then, of course, there's the ever-present possibility of Roman foul play. Octavian, after all, had a vested interest in controlling the narrative. The truth, as is often the case in history, is probably somewhere in the middle. What we do know is that Cleopatra's death marked the end of an era, and Cleopatra, well, she became a legend. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine Cleopatra, not in her death throes, but in her prime. Now, close your eyes and try not to dream of snakes. Sweet dreams. Alright, snuggle in a bit deeper. Let us talk about what happens after the curtain falls on Cleopatra's dramatic life. What echoes did her reign leave in the sands of Egypt and in the wider world? With her death, Egypt officially became a province of the Roman Empire. Think of it like this. Egypt went from being a fiercely independent kingdom with a dazzling queen to being. But her death marked the end of a Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of rulers who, for better or worse, had maintained Egypt's independence for nearly 3 centuries. So, there was a certain, let's call it nostalgia, that started to develop. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, became a sort of exotic symbol of conquered grandeur. It's a reminder of the vast wealth and ancient power that Rome now possessed. Fast forward a few centuries, and Cleopatra became a figure of immense interest during the Renaissance and beyond. Playwrights, poets, artists, they all became obsessed with her story. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra is probably the most famous example, but there were countless other plays, poems, tatenies, depicting her as a tragic heroine, a femme fatale, or a symbol of exotic beauty and power. It's amazing how one person can become so many different things to so many different people over so much time. In a world dominated by men, she managed to wield significant political power, challenging the norms of her time. She was a ruler, a diplomat, a scholar, and a mother. She was, in short, a complex and multifaceted individual. This life continues to fascinate us precisely because it defies easy categorization. She became a legend in Roman minds. A cautionary tale, maybe, of ambition and seductive power, but also undeniably captivating, right? But as a complex and fascinating individual whose life continues to resonate across the centuries. She was a woman who lived in extraordinary times, who faced extraordinary challenges, and who left an extraordinary mark on the world. And while her kingdom may have fallen, her legend, thankfully, lives on. Now, isn't that something to ponder as you drift off to dreamland? Sweet dreams. Some historians argue that her ambition and involvement with Roman politics ultimately led to Egypt's downfall. Others argue that she was simply trying to protect Egypt's interests in a world dominated by powerful empires. Historians are still debating her motivations and her legacy. And artists and writers are still finding inspiration in her remarkable life. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between. Think Elizabeth Taylor's iconic portrayal of Cleopatra in the 1963 film. Ashe represents a fascinating intersection of ancient history, political intrigue, romance, and tragedy. She is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a story of human lives, ambitions, and passions. In her story, even centuries later, continues to be retold, reimagined, and reinterpreted in countless ways. While not exactly historically accurate in every detail, or, let's be honest, in most details, it solidified Cleopatra's image as a stunningly beautiful and powerful woman in the popular imagination. It's a longing for a time when Egypt was ruled by Egyptians, even if that Egyptian was a Macedonian Greek in disguise, because the Cleopatra we know today is often a blend of historical fact, Roman propaganda, Renaissance interpretations, and Hollywood glamour. Well, her reign, though relatively short, marked a significant period in Egyptian history. She attempted to restore Egypt's power and influence in the region, playing a shrewd game of diplomacy with the Roman powers. She understood the importance of trade and maintained Egypt's economic prosperity, at least for a while, and she actively promoted Egyptian culture and religion, even while embracing Hellenistic traditions. It's a bit like a historical smoothie. Tasty maybe, but not necessarily a completely accurate representation of the original ingredients. Well, a very important, very wealthy, but ultimately controlled part of someone else's territory. It's like going from owning the whole bakery to just managing the oven. Still crucial, but not quite the same. It's a bit like dropping a pebble into a still pond. the ripples just keep going, even if you can't quite see the pebble anymore. Okay. Egypt became the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, feeding the legions and the ever-hungry citizens of Rome. This meant a lot of changes in how things were run, with Roman officials and tax collectors taking over roles previously held by Egyptians. It wasn't exactly a smooth transition. Imagine your local farmer suddenly having to explain his crop yield to someone who only speaks Latin and probably thinks you underreporting. Cleopatra's immediate legacy in Egypt was, well, a bit complicated, to put it mildly. The Romans, being Romans, were quite keen on exploiting Egypt's resources, especially its grain. The Romans, despite conquering Egypt, were also deeply fascinated by its ancient culture and, yes, by Cleopatra herself. Roman emperors, in a slightly bizarre display of power and historical appropriation, often incorporated Egyptian motifs into their art and architecture. Obelisks were shipped to Rome, Egyptian gods were worshipped, and images of Cleopatra, albeit often Romanized, appeared on coins and in artwork. It's like they couldn't quite decide whether to erase her or exploit her image. They ended up doing a bit of both. Now, Cleopatra wasn't exactly beloved by everyone in Egypt during her reign. Factions and rivalries existed, as they always do. But here's the fascinating thing. Even though Egypt was now under Roman rule, Cleopatra's image, her brand, if you will, continued to resonate. Think about it. Her influence didn't stop there. Artistic interpretations shaped how subsequent generations viewed Cleopatra. She became a fixture in popular culture, a glamorous and mysterious queen whose life was endlessly romanticized. And that's where the slightly odd part comes in. So, how did Cleopatra actually influence history beyond just being a captivating subject for art and drama? More subtly, Cleopatra's story highlights the complex relationship between power, gender, and history. Of course, her legacy is also tied to the decline of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the eventual Roman conquest of Egypt. Ultimately, Cleopatra's lasting influence lies in her enduring appeal as a historical figure. Think about it. Even now, archaeologists are still uncovering new artifacts and inscriptions that shed light on her reign and her world. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember Cleopatra not just as a beautiful queen or a tragic figure. Ah yes, tombs and treasures. The enduring allure of hidden riches, the whisper of gold waiting to be discovered, and the slightly morbid, yet undeniably fascinating, quest to find Cleopatra's final resting place. It's a story filled with speculation, archaeology, and the occasional whiff of Indiana Jones-style adventure. Unlike many pharaohs, Cleopatra doesn't have a monumental pyramid proclaiming, "Hey, look at me, I'm buried here." Her tomb was reportedly built during her lifetime. A grand and opulent structure intended to house her and her beloved Antony. One popular theory points towards Taposiris Magna, an ancient temple complex about 30 miles west of Alexandria. This site, dedicated to Osiris and Isis, has been the focus of extensive excavations led by Dr. Kathleen Martinez. Dr. Martinez, fascinating figure in her own right, abandoned a successful law career to pursue her passion for Egyptology, specifically finding Cleopatra. Now that's commitment. Accounts suggest it was near a temple of Isis, the goddess she's so closely identified with. Archaeologists have unearthed coins bearing her image, statues that resemble her, and a network of underground tunnels. Some speculate that these tunnels could lead to the actual tomb, hidden beneath the temple or in a secret chamber nearby. The discovery of mummies with gilded masks and noble burials further fuels the hope that Cleopatra's tomb might be in the vicinity. This was a deliberate power play, reinforcing her image as a divine ruler. Think of it as a pharaonic flex, a permanent advertisement of her godlike status. Though, let's be honest, usually with less boulder dodging and more meticulously brushing dirt off pottery shards. Ancient sources offer vague clues, placing it somewhere near Alexandria, the vibrant, cosmopolitan city she ruled. But Alexandria is, well, big. And over the past 2 millennia, earthquakes, tsunamis, rising sea levels, and good old-fashioned urban development have significantly altered the landscape. Buildings have crumbled, the coastline has shifted, and the sands of time have, quite literally, covered up a great many things. For centuries, people have wondered, where is Cleopatra? And, perhaps more tantalizingly, what did she take with her? We know she died in 30 BC after let's call it a dramatic series of events involving Mark Antony and a particularly persuasive Asp. The official story, spun for public consumption by Octavian, was that she died of snakebite. A convenient narrative, wouldn't you say, to allow Octavian to claim Egypt for Rome without the messy business of executing a queen in public. But back to the burning question, her tomb. Unfortunately, the exact location of this magnificent tomb remains a mystery. So, where to start looking? That's been the million-dollar question for archaeologists for generations. Why Taposiris Magna? Well, the area shows strong links to Cleopatra's reign. Imagine the scene. You're an archaeologist, carefully sifting through the sand, and suddenly you uncover a perfectly preserved golden mask. Your heart races, your hands tremble slightly, and you can help but wonder if you're about to stumble upon the discovery of a lifetime. It's the kind of moment that makes all the painstaking work, the long hours under the scorching sun, and the endless paperwork worthwhile. Of course, finding Cleopatra's tomb isn't just about the thrill of discovery. Gold, of course. Jewelry, precious stones, elaborate furniture, and perhaps even her royal regalia. There might be scrolls containing important documents, religious texts, or even personal letters. Imagine finding a letter written by Cleopatra herself. The possibilities are mind-boggling. It's a quest that has captivated imaginations for centuries, and one that may yet yield extraordinary discoveries. Whether or not she's ever found, the legend of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, will continue to fascinate and inspire for generations to come. And who knows? Maybe, just maybe, as you drift off to sleep tonight, you might dream of finding her yourself, uncovering the secrets of the past and bringing a lost queen back to life. Sweet dreams. It's also about what it could tell us about her life, her reign, and her world. The tomb could contain invaluable artifacts, providing insights into Egyptian burial rituals, the art and culture of the time, and perhaps even personal items that belonged to Cleopatra herself. Think of the historical knowledge locked away, waiting to be unlocked. Tomb robbing was a common practice in ancient Egypt, and many royal tombs were looted centuries ago. The Valley of the Kings, for example, was systematically plundered, despite the elaborate security measures put in place to protect the pharaoh's eternal resting places. Now, let's talk about the treasures. We all know that Cleopatra was rich. I mean, really rich. It's a sobering thought, but it's a reality that archaeologists have to face. Even if the tomb is empty, however, its discovery would still be a monumental achievement, providing valuable information about its construction, its design, since placed within a broader context of Egyptian history. Egypt was a wealthy kingdom, and as its ruler, she controlled vast resources, from gold mines to fertile farmland. Ancient accounts describe her opulent lifestyle, her extravagant parties, and her legendary barge, which was said to have sails of purple silk and a crew of hundreds. So, if Cleopatra was buried with the customary royal treasures, what might we expect to find? But here's the thing, even if the tomb is found, there's no guarantee it will be intact. So, there's a real possibility that Cleopatra's tomb has already been raided, its treasures scattered to the winds or melted down for their precious metals. The search for Cleopatra's tomb continues, driven by a combination of historical curiosity, scientific inquiry, and a healthy dose of romanticism. And now, as we gently float towards the land of Nod, let's consider something rather lovely: the lasting echoes of Cleopatra in art, literature, and even in our modern imaginations. Because, you see, while her reign ended quite some time ago, Cleopatra hasn't exactly gone away, has she? She's been popping up all over the place, like a particularly glamorous historical jack-in-the-box. Think about it. How many historical figures can you immediately conjure an image of? A few, perhaps, but Cleopatra. She's almost universally recognizable. Were always the most flattering portraits. 2 Renaissance paintings that depict her as a vision of exotic allure. Cleopatra has inspired artists for centuries. Think of elegant marble statues, capturing her regal bearing and timeless beauty. Sometimes she's depicted as a goddess, other times as a tragic heroine. Literature, too, has been absolutely bursting with Cleopatra-related content for centuries. He took the historical accounts and crafted a story of epic love, political intrigue, and tragic downfall. He paints Cleopatra as a powerful, intelligent, and utterly captivating woman, a match for any Roman general. And while Shakespeare certainly took liberties with the historical facts, his portrayal has had a profound impact on how we view Cleopatra, even today. From Shakespeare's magnificent tragedy, Antony and Cleopatra, which cemented her place in the popular imagination, to countless poems, novels, and even operas. Her story has been told and retold in every conceivable format. Either way, she's always presented as a figure of immense importance, even if that image is a swirling concoction of historical fact, dramatic interpretation, and a generous helping of artistic license. Artists like Michelangelo and Raphael, though they didn't dedicate entire works to her, were certainly influenced by the romanticized versions of her life that were circulating at the time. We see her depicted in allegorical scenes, often representing Egypt itself, dripping with jewels and surrounded by symbols of ancient power. And that, in itself, is rather remarkable. Oh, the drama. Think sweeping canvases filled with rich colors, dramatic lighting, and Cleopatra in the throes of some terribly important emotional moment, usually involving Antony and a strategically placed asp. These paintings weren't always historically accurate. Accuracy was unreally the point, but they captured the spirit of the legend. The passion, the power, the tragedy was all there, larger than life. From the moment the first Roman historian picked up his quill to write about her, Cleopatra was destined for myth. And, like all good myths, her story has been retold, reinterpreted, and reimagined countless times. Each generation, it seems, finds something new and compelling in her life. Her loves and her, shall we say, bold political strategies. Let's start with art, from ancient Roman coins that, let's be honest, the Renaissance, in particular, had a real Cleopatra obsession. Then, of course, came the Baroque period. And it wasn't just paintings. Sculptors, too, were captivated by Cleopatra's story. But her influence wasn't confined to the visual arts. Shakespeare's play, of course, is arguably the most famous example. But it's not just Shakespeare. Dryden, Shaw, and countless other playwrights have also tackled the Cleopatra story. Each version offers a slightly different perspective, reflecting the values and preoccupations of the time. 'Cause in the 20th and 21st centuries, Cleopatra has become a full-blown pop culture icon, from Hollywood blockbusters to comic books, from historical fiction novels to catchy pop songs. She's everywhere. Some portray her as a ruthless manipulator, others as a tragic victim of circumstance. But one thing remains constant: her undeniable power to fascinate. And then we get to the modern imagination. Now things get really interesting. Cleopatra has also appeared in countless other films, TV shows, and even video games. She's been portrayed as a strong and independent warrior, a cunning political strategist, and a romantic heroine. She knew how to play the game, and she played it well. Even her enemies respected her intellect and her cunning. Sometimes, she's even been reimagined as a futuristic space queen, which is, let's face it, pretty cool. It's a story of passion, betrayal, and ultimately, self-sacrifice. It's a story that has captured the hearts and minds of audiences for centuries. We know a lot about her life, but there are still many unanswered questions. What was she really like? What were her true motivations? God, what secrets did she keep hidden? That, in itself, is inherently fascinating. She defied expectations, challenged the status quo, and managed to rule Egypt for over 2 decades. Each generation tries to unravel the enigma of Cleopatra to understand the woman behind the legend. And perhaps, in doing so, we learn something about ourselves as well. That's no small feat, especially considering the political climate of the time. Think of Elizabeth Taylor's iconic portrayal in the 1963 film Cleopatra. Think about her power, her intelligence, her beauty, her tragedy. Think about the enduring legacy she has left behind. A legacy that continues to inspire and fascinate us centuries after her death. And remember, even in the deepest darkness, the echoes of the past can still resonate with extraordinary beauty and sweet dreams. It was a lavish, over-the-top spectacle that, while not entirely historically accurate, solidified Cleopatra's image as the ultimate glamorous queen. Imagine the quiet determination, the slow blossoming of ideas, the enduring spirit we've encountered together tonight. Let these images, softened by the day's end, cradle you as you breathe deeply. Remember that even in the grand tapestry of history, there is space for quiet moments, for reflection, for dreams waiting to be born. Release the day's worries and embrace the stillness that surrounds you. Sleep now, dear listener, and may your slumber be peaceful and restorative. Sweet dreams. The costumes, the sets, the sheer scale of the production. It was all designed to create a sense of awe and wonder, and it worked. But it's not just about big budget movies, What about the books? There are mountains of them. Biographies, historical fiction novels, romantic adventures, you name it. It's probably been written about Cleopatra. Some authors stick closely to the historical record, while others let their imaginations run wild, creating fantastical tales of ancient intrigue and romance. But why does Cleopatra continue to captivate us so much? What is it about her story that resonates so deeply across cultures and across time? Well, for one thing, she was a woman in a position of immense power in a world dominated by men. She was also incredibly intelligent and resourceful, spoke multiple languages, was a skilled diplomat, and a shrewd political strategist. And then there's the romance. It's a love affair with Mark Antony, the tragic tale of their downfall. It's the stuff of legends. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Cleopatra's myth is her sheer mystery. It's this sense of mystery that keeps us coming back to her story, time and time again. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Cleopatra. And so, as the stories of days gone by gently settle within you, allow yourself to drift